Good afternoon, and thank you for the introduction. This is going to be a challenge for me. As many of you have already spoken to me and my colleagues will know, this is a subject I can talk to you for hours about, and I've been given 20 minutes. So it's going to be some just very sort of short, sweet points, hopefully for you to take away. But I will be in the demo lounge and at the cocktail reception later on if any of you would like to come and talk about any of the topics I'm going to be covering. So the title is Sustained Success with Knowledge. Let's start off with then some of the key kind of lessons and things and the places you need to start. So I can talk about how you go forward with it, but you need kind of good foundation. One of the things that Rick mentioned this morning was so few organisations actually start by defining what good is in customer experience. And often we find people go into knowledge projects as well without being really clear about what success actually looks like at the end of it as well. So the starting point that I always recommend is what I call the vision board. This is a single page PowerPoint slide, and I'm more than happy to share this template with anybody that would like a copy afterwards. Where really I'm just kind of encouraging you to pull together that vision as to what does knowledge success look like. What does it look like from terms of the kind of customer experience and your agent experience? What does success look like from a business point of view? What are your KPIs? How are you actually going to measure that? And I find that this is a really useful tool throughout the life cycle of knowledge to keep referring back to be able to determine how you're doing and achieving those objectives, and to keep the project team and the operational team on track. So we understand what we're actually going to be aiming to achieve. Then we move into our planning stage. Now, a knowledge project can seem quite daunting, particularly across large enterprises. And the slide I've got up here is just a representative from a client that I worked with, where we were looking at implementing knowledge for agents across a number of different contact centres, to outsourcers, to retail branches, online to the customer base, and at the same time implementing some of the other channels such as mail and chat. So it's a very large, quite daunting project. The approach that we tend or the approach that we recommend, though, is to kind of look at this in bite-sized pieces. So, as I mentioned at the kind of the heading, plan for agility. Don't try to do it all at once. And it's the same with knowledge, is actually identify those bite-sized pieces that are going to contribute to your success towards your goals, implement, try it out, learn the lessons, and then incrementally add to that knowledge. So, once upon a time, they would have been the kind of projects whereby you needed to build all of your knowledge into the knowledge base before you could actually launch. Now we want you to go about it in a much more iterative and incremental way. The next element, and we've heard, again, Rick mentioned about sort of designing your customer experience, but equally designing the knowledge experience is just as important. So I'm going to pick up on a few kind of, approaches and things to think about during the design. The first one is actually determining who your knowledge stakeholders are. It's very easy to say we're going to build a knowledge base for our employees, or we're going to build a knowledge base for our customers, but your stakeholders are generally wider than that. So you need to think about the business, what metrics do they actually want? So they're stakeholders in terms of they have a stake in the output from however successful that solution actually is. You might need to think about from an executive point of view what they're going to need in terms of justifying investment in the future. You're going to have stakeholders in terms of the people that own your products and services who are going to be providing content and information that's going to go into your knowledge base. So actually starting off by identifying all of these people, what their needs are going to be from your knowledge project is an important step in terms of ensuring that you design a solution that is going to meet their needs. And that's important from a sustainability point of view because clearly you want to ensure that you have their buy-in in order to kind of build and develop the knowledge base as you go forwards. Equally important is the knowledge, that the content that is actually going to go into your knowledge base. So once you understand who's going to be using it and what their needs are, take stock of the actual content and where that sits within your organizations. That can be a whole variety of places. It can be in kind of existing systems such as SharePoint. You might have an intranet. You might have just Word documents. Frequently, it'll be in a whole series of emails that have been distributed around the organization. And if you go and walk around the contact centers, you're often going to find post-it notes and other bits of information, not to mention the completely undocumented knowledge that resides in people's heads. So we encourage you, first of all, before launching into building something, take a step back, take stock, actually understand what your knowledge landscape actually looks like and what needs to be included within your system, again, for it to be considered successful. And that's really important, because if you build something that is just your policy and procedures from SharePoint, and half of your agents are referring to the Post-it notes on their desk, then they're still going to do that once your new knowledge system is launched as well. And I think that's one of the comments that Paylocity mentioned when we were in conversation as well, which is their system is not just about the kind of questions that the customers are going to be asking them. They've now extended it out to everything that the agent actually needs to know to improve their experience, which might include just internal company information as well. Having kind of pulled together and understand your content landscape, then you need to do some analysis to determine what you're going to do with that. I talked about planning for agility, so clearly what we're not going to do is to take all of that and try and build it into a knowledge base in one go. So start to identify what is the important knowledge that we need to build in terms of meeting our kind of first set of objectives for our first sprints. But it might mean then that we're going to provide access to external sources of information by federating it, by actually allowing them to have access through that single portal. There might be information that we're going to migrate as is because we think that the quality is good enough. There might be content as part of that audit that you identify that perhaps hasn't been maintained for years, it's completely out of date. You might want to delete, actually do some housekeeping on that as well. So that's also a great opportunity to tidy things up and focus your content on the things that people really need to know, not what you've actually just made available over the years. The next element is actually, having decided kind of what content is going to be useful and what you might do with it, is where should it go? And actually, despite the fact that I'm standing here at an eGain event and I'm talking about it from an eGain point of view, the answer is not necessarily eGain in every case. If you've got people building and maintaining content and information in a system that is outside of sort of eGain, that is not going to be used by users of eGain, then clearly there's not much point in actually putting it into an eGain system. But some of that information might be useful to just kind of access externally. Perhaps it's something that's kind of referred to but maintained, such as interest rates, for instance, which might not be actually knowledge itself, but information that your knowledge and process might bring in order to inform decisions within the knowledge base. The next element is, once you've kind of got content, is think about all of those other things which are now going to start to impact the experience of the people that are using this. So some of those elements, we talked about identifying user needs, but it may well be in a global organization. You need to start thinking about whether or not different languages are going to be required. As part of that, it might be culture. So if you've actually got clients in the Middle East, as I've worked with, then their company culture and the way that they use systems is going to be quite different, perhaps to here in the US or in Europe. The channels that you are going to make that content available through. So if you're going to be using it to support social interactions, so kind of sort of Facebook or Twitter, then the way that you design some of that content to be utilized might be very different to self-service via the web, or the information that you're going to put in front of your agents. And the devices, too, that people access it from will have an influence. So really, again, it's a case of considering all of those different things that are impacting your customer experience and sitting down and actually designing that experience in a kind of mindful and thoughtful way. Oh, sorry, I was looking at the wrong slide and I hadn't built the whole thing. Anyway, sorry, I was talking about it even if you couldn't see it. So having kind of then pulled all of this together in our design, the next thing about it is how you present that content. Now you've seen the agent desktop, you've seen some examples from customers, so I'm just going to be putting up a couple here. Here's one example from a customer which I think should be instantly familiar to everybody from wherever they're from, which is Lego. So one of the elements is about how you present that information either to your customers or your agents. And even within our own Flex desktop, it is possible to kind of customize and to put a kind of presentation layer on the portal to actually brand that. So for instance, if you were an outsourcer dealing with multiple clients, you could actually have that knowledge branded and looking in a way that actually reflected your kind of client identity as well. But I think the great thing here again is we're not talking about a product that is just out of the box that you just kind of take as it is. We're giving you complete flexibility to design to demonstrate your customer experience, your branding and styling, and the way that you want to interact. And you can actually do this differently for different devices, for different brands, even within the same organization. Now with Lego, I'm also just putting up here an example of the guided process as they use it for the customers. Now with Lego, one of the things that they did is to identify, or they started off implementing knowledge as relatively straightforward FAQs. They identified that there were some areas of complexity within the business, which even their agents were apparently immediately escalating off to second line, simply because they weren't comfortable about how they dealt with it. So we had one of our consultants work with them to build guided processes to help support them. As soon as the agents became really comfortable and they were able to demonstrate through analytics that there were far less escalations to their kind of second line, they then looked at making that information available to their customers. And this is an example of what the guided process might look in a customer-facing environment. In this particular case, it's a power supply problem with batteries in their trains. The next slide I'm showing you here is a similar approach, but you've already seen this, I think, 3 times already, actually. I didn't realize that when I put this one in, which is EE, a very, very different look and feel for their agents. And David already talked about kind of their approach in terms of how they actually came up with this design. I guess the point that I'm making is these are visually very different, driven by the same kind of knowledge project. So it really comes down, again, it's that whole thing about, think about the experience, the design. Make it fun, potentially. Lego have made it as fun for their agents as they have for their customers, and actually encourage that kind of buy-in. Because actually one of the keys to the long-term success and sustainability of knowledge is actually getting people to use it, but also creating an environment in which they're feeding back, they're making suggestions, and that the solution is actually part of how they do things. It's the agent's system. It's not just something that you've put as another application onto the desktop. So part of that, and I'm using the word kind of nurture quite specifically, because what you actually also need to do is treat knowledge like a living, breathing thing. It's not something that you just do as a project and then walk away from. Sustainability is about making that part of your culture and actually having the organization and the process behind it. So one of the things I'm outlining here is a typical organization for a kind of knowledge team. And when I say typical, it's going to vary with different clients. Might be different numbers of people. Some of the roles that we've outlined here might actually be taken up by kind of the same person. But the typical model would be to have a centralized knowledge organization, pulling in content, maintaining it, and publishing it in a consistent way to the rest of the organization. But just simply having the resources in place and trained isn't enough. What you also need to do is to make sure that you've got the right processes in place so that you're identifying all of those different triggers that are likely to result in some requirement for a change to knowledge. It might be suggestions and feedback from your agents, but that's only one of them. There are lots of things that will happen in your organizations which will also lead to that need to change. Your own kind of product managers, for instance, your service delivery are going to be identifying all the time like either new products, changes that are required, and it's really important that your knowledge organization is closely aligned with that such that you're hearing about them in advance. So actually the whole kind of changing and developing knowledge becomes part of your whole process of how you actually ship products and services as well. On top of that, another trigger would actually be something like analytics. So there's the kind of sort of reactive in terms of people telling you and your organization about changes that are required, but equally a level of analysis will help you identify changes that might be required. So in other words, people are using search terms that are not returning any information. They're following a process which they deem to be unsuccessful. Maybe the kind of customer satisfaction related to a use of a particular process is low, and all of these things should actually prompt you to then go in, identify why, and to make those changes and improvements. Now the next slide is very busy, eventually, But I'm putting this up because I think it's something I developed with another client, but actually to show all of the things that I think come together to make a knowledge project successful. So we start off with the, let's say, the system architecture, but basically your ability to actually get this solution out to the end users that are actually there, this sort of system readiness. So that's clearly one element, is that when you launch it, you actually need to have the kind of whole kind of platform and accessibility. On top of that, you need to have your knowledge base ready. And the other element is user readiness. Now, in a contact center, this is particularly important. I think we've heard a few stories about how people have actually encouraged that, almost generating demand and a pull from the organization for it, rather than just pushing it out. But there's, again, a number of things that you can do in terms of the communication plans. This particular client that this was built for developed training videos that they were able to show. So they developed a whole kind of branding behind it. They got the kind of clients, their agents excited. And the other element behind this then is your business readiness. Because again, once you've actually developed a project and rolled it out, it's really easy to get overly excited, but make sure that the other areas of the business are aware of what's kind of coming and how it might impact them and what the timescales are. So there are a lot of things here in terms of being ready to launch a knowledge project. And the thing about it is that very few of these are actually technological and product. A lot of them really are about the whole kind of change management and transformation functions. And I've not put this up to scare you. I've put it up because I think people have found it quite useful as a checklist if you're thinking about launching knowledge, just to be able to go through and to say, are any of these, which of these things are relevant to us? Is there anything I've not thought of and I should have done? The other side, once you've actually launched, are clearly making sure that you've got the kind of right system support mechanisms in place, that you've got your knowledge management processes, the governance. And one of the pieces of advice I would give anybody thinking about starting out as a project is that once you launch your first kind of tranche of knowledge, you've still got probably project activity to do in terms of actually continuing to kind of build and roll that out, is actually separate out the functions. Because one of the things you don't want to do is to have your project activity in terms of developing and rolling out new content impacted by the feedback and suggestions that you'll get. In other words, make sure you've got your business as usual processes in place at the same time as actually running the project activities. We've then got the elements of performance management, so that's all about your analytics and how your knowledge base is actually performing and what you're going to do about that. And then the final element is basically integrating into your kind of business as usual operation. So this is now about how do you actually move from project mode into actually this being kind of operational and part of your company culture. The last slide I'm going to show at this stage is something that we do called a health check. So actually we've got this project, we're sort of talking about all the things that you need to do, there's kind of quite a big checklist there, but actually we have a health check approach whereby we can kind of come in with a whole series of kind of questions and a number of points whereby we will kind of check how you are performing and we can advise and guide versus other customers. The one thing that's become apparent is us doing that 3 or 4 months after you've gone live and going, you didn't do that very well, did you? Is not anywhere near as useful as us working alongside you and actually guiding and advising you up front to make sure that it's as successful as you can be. So the next thing I'm going to touch on is something that Ashu also brought up this morning, is the new approach to delivering services, which is our value assurance partnership. And we've named that quite carefully because we understand, and I'm talking particularly around knowledge, that they can be quite complex and daunting projects in some cases. So what we're actually aiming to do is to make sure that we set up so that we're working alongside you for the kind of life cycle of your relationship with eGain, and not just delivering as a project that we then walk away from. Because actually what we want to do is to ensure that you are successful, and for those of you starting thinking about knowledge projects now, that you're also standing up here and talking about your successes kind of next year and in the years to come. And why do we think that's important? We think this is important because, the speed of change, firstly, is that if we work out what your project requirements are today, then probably in 3 or 4 months they're going to have changed as your businesses are changing. So we want to be working alongside you and helping you to kind of adapt and be flexible based on the experience that we can bring. You've also heard during the day about the technological innovation that we're bringing out, so kind of constantly looking at how can we improve the product, not just with knowledge, but some of those other elements that might sit alongside that. So you might be thinking about web self-service in terms of putting up kind of some knowledge on the web today, but maybe kind of in 2 or 3 months' time, you want to think about how might you front-end that with a virtual assistant and actually take advantage of some of the knowledge and content that you've built, and we can help you do those things. And equally, whilst we accept that a lot of our customers have actually got a lot of kind of, industry experience, in some areas you've got much more experience than we have, we're working with kind of, tens, hundreds of customers in terms of helping them to implement, and we're learning a lot of lessons, and we want to actually be able to bring that to you as well. I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip through very, very quickly. I think, again, Ash, you kind of mentioned about how we would go about this, but it's all about building out a plan with you at the start of our engagement, and then having the kind of regular touch points and reviews such that we make sure that we're kind of keeping you on track or kind of helping steer you in other directions if that's appropriate. And one of the things we also just want to make available to you is this kind of idea of kind of innovation in 30 days. Ashu talked very much about the AI in 30 days, which I think is getting people really excited, but there might be other bits of the technology that you would also want to try during that. And as part of that whole partnership, we would be looking at kind of giving you easy access to that, as well as making the right skills available if it was just something you wanted some advice on the housekeeping of your system, if you wanted to expand your knowledge into a different area and wanted some advice on how you might go about it, and all of those other kind of questions that come up during the life cycle of running your project. Okay, so that brings me to the end of the presentation. Quite a lot of brain dump there. I hope it made some kind of sense in some sort of way to people, but please feel free to come and have a chat about any aspect of this you might be interested in after the sessions are finished. Thank you very much.